Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar today. And welcome to this session of the 2019-2020 Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host, Lauren Cooper, and I'm the lead of the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University. We are so pleased to host this year's Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. For those that don't know, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. We've currently been in the process of reinvigorating our focus and activities and welcome inquiries into our work. So please reach out if you have questions or you think your organization may be interested in joining. Here you can see the full lineup of the speaker series. And so thank you for those that have joined in the past. And if you see some future interest, feel free to get to our website and sign up. To get to today's speakers, I'd like to introduce Duncan McKinley and Aurora Cutler of the U.S. Forest Service Office of Sustainability and Climate, where Duncan is a natural resource management specialist and Aurora is an information and education specialist. Here in the MSU Forest, Carbon, and Climate program, we've become increasingly familiar with the great work of this office, of the Office of Sustainability and Climate. And through a partnership between our organizations, we are actively working on efforts to bring increased clarity to forest, carbon, and climate topics, particularly in regards to planning and management activities in the national forest system. This includes outputs like interactive short videos, white papers, and support for natural resource managers in the nation's forests. Today's session will focus on the Forest Service's approach to federal planning and capacity building for carbon. Please note that today, Duncan and Aurora will take turns speaking throughout their presentation. We're really excited to get started today, but before we do, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping details. To automatically receive any registration details and information about upcoming webinars like those we saw in the opening poster, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. For those that are eligible, today the attendees will be qualified to receive 1 CFE credit for Society of American Foresters. If you've registered today with your professional email address that's linked to SAF, this will happen automatically, but please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And again, at forestc@msu.edu. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the web on the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program website, along with any supplemental materials or resources that are mentioned, including the presentation slides, a PDF of the slides, in a next week or so. We try to get this done within a week. If you've registered, you'll get notice when these are available. We do a Q&A at the end of the session today, and you are encouraged to submit questions at any point. There is a chat feature, and it's on the Zoom interface, which is a little bar that can sometimes disappear on you. So if it does, just need to hover your mouse around, and this menu bar will pop up. There's a chat function with a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions at any point during the presentations. We will compile and present the questions to the speakers in a Q&A session, time permitting. If you're calling in on the phone and you decide you have a question and you can access email, you can send us questions to forestc@msu.edu as well, and we'll make sure they're in the mix. In the case of outstanding questions, and we are getting a nice size group these days, so it's a little tricky to get to all the questions. So we will follow up with the speakers and have these addressed and put them into a document that will be shared as a PDF with the presentation materials when those are posted. And so with that, I will hand it over to our speakers. So Duncan and Aurora, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
All right, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you very well.
Great. So I'm Duncan McKinley, and Aurora Cutler is also co-presenting with me. And we're really excited to be here with you guys today. We really appreciate the invitation. And what we want to share with you today is how we went through a process of delivering scientific information to decision-making for the National Forest System. This has been a long and interesting journey. And there's some lessons learned and approaches that we like to share with you in case you're in a similar situation and want to take advantage of what we've learned. So what is the National Forest System? The National Forest System comprises about 193 million acres, of which about 145 million acres are forests. This is about 20% of the entire land area of forests in the United States, so this is a pretty significant area. The forest system itself is made up of 154 national forests, national grasslands, and other units such as experimental forests. An interesting note is that these forests contain about 10,382 million metric tons of carbon. So we manage a lot of carbon in the forest system. So today we're going to talk about why are Forest Service land managers interested in forest carbon. We're going to talk about some of our goals when we started embarking on this approach that we're going to share today, and how we delivered on that. We're going to outline some key challenges, and along the way there were some real neat innovations that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to round out with some final take-home messages for you. So why are Forest Service land managers interested in forest carbon? Well, to answer that question, we really need to ask, well, why is the public interested? And so I kind of summarized a couple of points here, because when the public is interested in stuff, that kind of manifests itself in policies that we'll see here in a second. So the public is generally concerned about carbon emissions and effect on climate. There's a lot of interest in using forest management to sequester carbon, such as mitigation, and reduce carbon loss where appropriate, and that's associated with adaptation. If you want some further reading about how forests interact with the atmosphere and some mitigation and adaptation strategies, I listed a couple of papers here for your reference. So looking at some of the policies that have manifested over the years in response to public interest, I want to point to the 2012 planning rule. So every 10 years or so, the national forests are required to revise their land management plan. And the 2012 rule, it requires that when forests are going under revision, they consider carbon. So they need to have a carbon assessment that addresses a number of key questions, such as what is the role of forests in sequestering carbon? What are the effects of disturbances in management of carbon stocks, and how carbon might be influenced by management? So I want to point out here that this is focused on stocks and change to those stocks. Our NEPA guidance is responding to the National Environmental Policy Act. So whenever we're doing a land management activity or doing forest plans that might have a significant environmental impact, we need to look at what those effects might be. So under our internal guidance, we look at climate change, and in some cases we look at what are those effects of projects on climate, and also what are the effects of climate on projects, and also carbon sequestration and things like that. I want to point out that this is focused more on the greenhouse gas emission side, but these are really two sides of the same coin, because stocks sometimes become flexes, and sometimes greenhouse gases, and sometimes greenhouse gases become stocks at some point. One thing I want to note here is that the Forest Service is not managing, is not currently mitigating climate change through forest management. We are managing the carbon that's in the forest, but we're not managing the forest for carbon. And part of that is because of we have a multiple use mandate where we need to consider all the ecosystem services that forests provide without giving preference to one. So before we started, we faced a number of challenges with delivering carbon science. First of all, beyond just the real basic forest carbon dynamics, it's really difficult to teach and communicate, especially in the context of forest management and what those implications might be. So this led to a proliferation and sometimes conflicting perspectives. And that's one of the things that we noticed very early on in this work, is people are saying different things about the same management activity, coming to very different conclusions. So it took us a while to figure that out. And we're going to delve a little bit deeper into what that is and when Aurora speaks. So there's also a lot of challenges associated with communicating the benefits of forest management, both in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. So that was a real challenge. The other challenges here is that the carbon literacy among our practitioners and our managers was not particularly strong in the agency. So when we were able to actually deliver the science before, when the science became available, I should say, it wasn't really readily interpretable by the folks in the field who would be using it. And it was difficult for them to figure out, what does the science mean for the implications of what I'm doing for the project or for my forest plan? So the early efforts led to kind of very unfocused efforts to inform decision making, because if you really don't understand the science, you just kind of, what I call kitchen sink it. You kind of throw everything in the kitchen sink out there as hoping that you're going to hit all the important stuff. The problem is that you kind of underemphasize the stuff that's really important and perhaps overemphasize the stuff that's not important at all. So the other issue was there was a lack of consistent carbon information at a relevant scale. The relevant scale, what I'm talking about here, is the forest unit, which varies. And so individual forests had to pull from a hodgepodge of information and tools. There might be a peer-reviewed publication that a scientist nearby published on forest carbon dynamics, for example, but that may or may not be specific to the forest. And some forests didn't have any information whatsoever. And also tools. There's a number of different tools out there, so which ones do you use to help inform decision making? So that was kind of an outstanding challenge for us. And also the information was very rarely at a scale that was relevant for us. It was either too broad, or such as perhaps on the state level or regional level, or it was too specific to a specific stand or some dynamics that were going on in the forest. So our overall goals in delivering science across our national forest system was to make sure the information answers to the policy needs and thereby enter into what the public is interested in. We wanted to produce information that is relevant for decision making, easy to interpret, and informative. Just not producing information to have information. We needed it to be based on the best available science. And we wanted information and an approach that was consistent and transferable among national units. One, to be able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, but also a nice consistent approach. It made it easy to transfer information or ideas from one forest to another seamlessly. And also we were looking to reduce the burden on individual national forests, while greatly improving the quality of information for decision makers and the public. So I'm going to switch over to Aurora, who's going to take over the next few minutes.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. So just a little background on how I came into the forest carbon world. I don't have a degree in carbon or really anything natural resource science-based. I'm a communicator and a visual storyteller. It's taken me almost 3 years to completely understand these concepts. This cartoon pretty much sums up how I initially thought of carbon and how many other people think about it. It's really about what people see with the information presented in front of them, or in this case, what they don't see. Next slide, please. Like the elephant example we just looked at, we see people taking different perspectives based on their understanding and the information presented right in front of them. Much like that elephant figure, we can look narrowly at the leg and see a tree trunk, or the tail and see a rope, or we can look more broadly to see the whole picture and see the entire elephant in all of its parts. These different perspectives on how to conceptualize the forest system is the greatest source of confusion and conflict. It certainly was for me. So now we're going to take a look at both views, the narrow and the broad. First, we'll start with the narrow view. This is the most common view of how people see the forest system. The narrow view assumes two things. One, the only positive management approach is growing forests and planting trees. because by doing this, it takes up carbon from the atmosphere. And 2, forest management activities such as timber harvesting, restoration, or prescribed fires immediately release carbon from the forest to the atmosphere, where that carbon is destined to stay forever. This narrow view does not consider space and time or where the carbon goes when it leaves the ecosystem. It also doesn't consider the carbon cycle when forests begin to regrow after management activities. Next slide. So we know there's a lot more to the story of carbon. Next slide. So to better understand how trees and wood products store and cycle carbon, let's pretend that the atmosphere is the landlord and carbon emissions are the tenants. When people use fossil fuels like oil and coal, way too many tenants go to the atmosphere. Actually, they aren't really tenants at all. They're more like pesky squatters. They stay forever. And this happens because the atmosphere has no way of evicting or escorting them back from where they came, deep within the earth. They are called fossil for a reason. They took millions of years to be stored in the earth under conditions Earth may never experience again. Whereas if the only carbon emissions humans sent to the atmosphere were derived through decomposition or burning of wood and vegetation, sure, we would see some tenants, but they would naturally cycle into new vegetation growth and not permanently control the dial of our thermostat like the fossil fuel squatters. These biogenic carbon emissions would stay only the duration of their short-term contracts and politely leave over time as a regenerating forest calls them back. So on this graphic, on the right side, the biogenic cycle returns the carbon through the regrowth of the forest. And on the left side, the same mechanism of sending carbon back doesn't exist for fossil fuels. Next slide. So now that we are clear about the role of the atmosphere as the landlord of carbon emissions, we are now ready to dive into the broad view of the forest system. So we know that forests are dynamic systems that naturally undergo changes in carbon storage and carbon release. They have natural boom and bust cycles. Carbon increases through growth and then decreases through some type of loss. Carbon uptake and storage occur during tree growth, and then carbon releases quickly from forests in the case of intense wildfires, or slowly as trees fall and decompose. Fallen decomposing trees release carbon very slowly to below ground carbon pools and later back into the atmosphere. Then forests regrow and recover the carbon that was lost. And this plays out over many decades. At any one time or point in the landscape, forests may be at different stages of this progression. Next slide. So in front of us, we see the boom and bust cycle I just discussed as that inner circle. Timber harvesting transfers carbon off the forest ecosystem, and that carbon is stored in harvested wood products we use in our everyday lives, like lumber, paper, fuel, and long-lived wood products such as lumber or furniture store carbon for many decades or even centuries. Just think of like a wooden house. Residues from harvested wood can also be used as an energy source. The carbon is released back to the atmosphere through energy generation, like the burning of wood pellets or logs in a wood stove. So on the right side of this graphic, you can see that those pesky fossil fuel emissions doing what they do, becoming lifetime squatters and freeloaders up in the atmosphere. But we can avoid those freeloaders when we use wood products or bioenergy in place of fossil fuels like coal or oil, and we call this the substitution effect. We avoid the permanent release of a fossil fuel-based carbon into the atmosphere. When we substitute wood products for fossil fuels and fossil fuel-intensive materials, the unused fossil fuel carbon remains stored in the ground and does not enter the atmosphere. So we have that avoided emission. With these examples, it's possible to see how forest carbon, including the use of forest materials and forest regrowth, represent this closed loop cycle. For each of these closed loop pathways, the forest remains forest. It recovers and it regrows, resulting in the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere once again. Next slide. As I just mentioned, the closed loop system depends on forest regrowing and reabsorbing the carbon that was removed from the ecosystem. This happens with management activities we saw from the previous cycle slide. If land use is converted to a non-forest, such as for agriculture or a parking lot or a development, then there is no reabsorption of the carbon. The carbon is lost to the atmosphere. Some carbon will stay in the soils, but we lose all of the above ground carbon and it's not coming back. So land use change has essentially the same impact as fossil fuel emissions because the carbon cycle is broken and we have permanent freeloaders up in the atmosphere. Next slide. So this is probably the most important slide I'm going to show you. The outcome we are looking for is what's happening in the atmosphere, or what the atmosphere, the landlord, sees in terms of carbon. This requires taking a systems approach. First, we can either look at what's happening on the forest from the narrow view or the broad view. So in the narrow view, the goal is to maximize carbon stocks by planting more trees and not actively thinning or harvesting trees. A narrow view of the forest system tends to focus on carbon flows into and out of the forest ecosystem and assumes that all carbon leaving the ecosystem immediately enters the atmosphere. So then applying a systems approach, or taking a few steps back and seeing the entire elephant, then we see a much broader view plane. We see how the forest ecosystem interacts with other services used by society. We consider how the wood is used when it leaves the ecosystem, how wood and biomass energy influence the use of fossil fuels, often reducing the need for them either in producing energy or creating alternative products that require much less energy to produce, like the substitution effect we discussed earlier. And then we must also consider land use change. Are we losing forest cover indefinitely, or will the forest not be able to recover? So taking collectively in a whole systems approach, we then can only understand impacts on what we care about. The point here is if we look at all things together, we understand the net effects of activities on the atmosphere. This systems approach is derived from the best available science and adapted from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Next slide. So finally, to really demonstrate these two perspectives, I'm going to walk you through the narrow and broad view one more time so you can really understand how these different perspectives lead to very different conclusions about management activities. Again, think of feeling and not seeing the elephant leg and tail, and then seeing the entire elephant. So here we have, oh, can you click over? There we go. Here we have the identical treatments on a hypothetical stand and harvest schedule. 40-year harvest rotations in Douglas fir. So the x-axis shows time in years, and the y-axis shows the cumulative carbon storage. The orange dashed line shows the total carbon storage if the harvesting events had not occurred. The graph on the left shows the Douglas fir stand that is clear-cut every 40 years. In this scenario, carbon in above ground live trees drops to near zero when it's harvested, assuming it's a clear-cut. Carbon leaves the ecosystem and enters the atmosphere. Over time, the forest regrows and the stand recovers that carbon, but the carbon stocks for this stand never reach the full carbon storage potential of the ecosystem as seen by the no harvest line. In this narrow view, this left side, timber harvesting results in a net loss of carbon storage and a net increase in carbon emissions. The right graphic illustrates the same hypothetical stand and harvest schedule, but shows that the carbon is transferred to the harvested wood product sector and is stored in various product pools, such as long-lived products, short-lived products, and landfills. It also estimates the substitution benefits, or those avoided emissions, of using wood products in place of more emission-intensive materials like steel or concrete, and of using wood-based renewable energy in place of fossil fuel energy. When considering carbon storage, on this right graphic, in harvested wood products and substitution effects, timber harvesting results in net increase in carbon storage and net decrease in carbon emissions. So the perspective you take can result in radically different conclusions about the exact same management activity. We are interested in choosing a perspective that is supported by the best available science. And with that, I'll hand it back to Duncan for now.
So the approach that we decided to deliver the information was a template-based approach that used nationally consistent data that was framed in the best available science that Aurora just illustrated, and based on the current guidance and policies that we have. It really took putting together a lot of different pieces, and we're going to go through that in the next few slides. So why and how were the templates developed? We were getting a lot of questions and requests for help from the field or the end users in terms of how to disclose carbon for NEPA or how to use carbon information for planning. And some of the things that they were really struggling with is the shifting policy environment. And there was also some confusion about what role the National Forest System plays, for example. And there was also, coupled with that, with a general lack of carbon literacy on the science of carbon. So we worked really closely with Forest Service research and development. They were instrumental in developing the science that we're using for the National Forest System. We used a co-production model. So we had scientists, translators like myself and Aurora, work really closely with folks in the field, the people who are actually doing the work. And in fact, we rolled up our sleeves and actually did a NEPA disclosure. We actually did a planning document just to understand what it actually entails in the field and what information they need and get into that mindset. So that was really, really important. So, but we also were very adaptive as we were moving this from forest to forest, from region to region. There's different approaches, different thinking, different approaches to doing NEPA and planning, and different thinking about what the public is interested in that particular area. So we had to adapt what we're going to do, what we were doing, but we landed on a pretty solid approach that's very consistent, as we'll see in a few minutes. So let's talk a little bit about the science. So the science was done for every national forest, every unit, every national forest, I should say. And it consists of two major reports. The first one looks at the baseline report, stock change, which we call the baseline report. And the second one is really what we call the disturbance report, which looks at the impacts of management and disturbances, the impacts being timber harvesting, wildfire, insects, disease, storms, climate, other environmental factors, you name it. So it's really a comprehensive report, and they're very specific to our system. So these reports have three major tools. One is the carbon calculation tool, and this one is used for the baseline report. This is based on FIA data, which is Forest Inventory Analysis. They have thousands of plots all across the United States, both on Forest Service land, but also private land and state land as well. And that you're able to derive some really basic stock information and how those stocks are changing over time. The second model is the Forest Carbon Management Framework, called FORCAMP. And basically what that does is use FIA-based data, but also Landsat imagery. Basically, a team of folks had to go through and look at, for each year, we looked at a 20-year period, look at disturbances on each national forest and digitize them, whether that was insects and disease, wildfire management, you name it. And it also incorporated forest vegetation simulator to see how these carbon dynamics would change over time. We also use the Integrated Terrestrial Ecosystem Carbon, or INTEC model, and basically uses FIA, the Landsat imagery, but also a suite of different environmental factors such as climate, CO2, nitrogen deposition, and also the age class structures of the forest. So together they provide a very powerful suite of tools that are very effective in providing information that we need. So this is an example of some of the questions that you can ask. On the y-axis here has the continuity of monitoring data, and the y-axis is the analysis complexity, going from very empirical to more modeled. And what we can see is some of the questions that you can ask with this is how much total carbon is on the landscape. So this is the information to provide through FIA and the carbon calculation tool. Harvested wood products, you can also, is part of that. we can ask the question, how is management and disturbance affected total carbon? And we can have answer those questions. We can also ask, how does the effect of management and disturbance compare with atmospheric and climatic changes? So there's a lot of different questions that you can ask with this. So one of the things I wanted to illustrate is some of the challenges with interpretation. When the science became available, before we worked on helping folks interpret it and delivering an approach, we would get questions like this. How did that huge wildfire a few years ago affect whether my forest or region is a carbon source or a sink? So let's delve a little bit deeper into that. So one of the things that we really struggled with is how to reconcile the temporal and spatial scale in which these dynamics play out across a forest or a landscape with the context of a decision. So what we see here is a number of different things that are going on in this is a hypothetical landscape. And you might see, if you look right there in the middle, you might see forest regrowing. And the green bar would indicate that the flux is the forests are taking up more carbon than they're releasing, which the releasing line is the red line there. But that, you wouldn't draw a conclusion about an entire forest based on one part of the forest. So there's lots of things going on in the forest simultaneously. There could be wildfires, there could be portions that are old growth, there could be portions that are being harvested, and they all are either emitting or taking up carbon, and all this is happening simultaneously. So how do you deal with that in terms of providing information for a decision? So one of the things I wanted to point out here that addresses that question is a real life example. So there was a Hayman fire, a fire in Colorado back in 2002 called the Hayman Fire. It was the largest in the state's history at the time, about 250,000 acres. But let's look at what happened on the National Forest System part of it. That burned about 135,000 acres, or about 211 square miles. If you think about it, that's a massive area. If you stood in the middle of this, that's 10 miles wide and 20 miles long. You could literally stand in the middle in every direction, see something like you would see here in this picture. But although it is stunning visually from our human perspective, it only affected about 4.9% of the forested area, which is a little over 3 million acres. So if we assumed that this was high severity fire on all the acres, which is a big assumption, and that did not occur, there was less severe fires in areas that the trees weren't killed. But let's assume that for the sake of argument, that would result in roughly 1.76 teragrams of carbon being volatilized during the fire. A teragram is 1 million metric tons. So to put that in context, in 2013, the forest carbon stocks at the time were estimated about 82.7 teragrams with an error of about plus or minus 8 teragrams. We've seen a consistent downward trend since 1990, suggesting a broad scale change, but how much of this is a result of that fire? Well, if you look at this data here, the disturbance assessments on the left, you can see that it detected the fire, and that's how we know about roughly 4.9% of the landscape was affected. However, we do not see this in the baseline assessments, and there's a number of reasons why you may not see that methodologically, but because there's a latency period in the data. But if you were to see it, this is what that would look like. We're talking about something that is 1/8, a signal that's about 1/8 of the noise that we're seeing. So keep in mind that once after this fire occurred, the forest is going through the cycle that Aurora articulated earlier, where you're having this effect and there's going to be a regrowth. So if we look at the region more broadly, this particular region of the Forest Service has 12 national forests. 2 of the national forests are declining over time, but the other 10 national forests are trending upwards. So just to drive this home, you don't want to be making inferences about an entire forest based off a single stand. But as you get more and more area that you're considering, that noise starts to decrease a little bit. So that's the scale. The larger area is required to be able to detect patterns and trends. So if you look across the region during a recent 8-year period, we actually saw a net accrual or sequestration of about 27 teragrams of carbon. So this accrual that we're seeing, this increase in carbon stocks, we're seeing this a lot across the national forest system. It's actually consistent with what we're seeing nationally across all forests in the United States. Currently, we're seeing about roughly 200 teragrams of carbon being taken up by forests every year in the United States. But it's important to understand the context in that. In the last 100 years or so is a period of major recovery. Prior to this, due to land use change and having a wood-based economy, the 300 years before that, folks were really using the forest really heavily, not using sustainable practices, clearing lots of forests for agriculture and such. So we ended up losing historically about 60% of all the carbon that was there before pre-European settlement. So that's an important legacy effect to consider when you're seeing carbon accruing in the national forest system in the U.S. In general. So to answer the question to put things in context, can we put individual management actions or disturbances in context of forest level dynamics? So as I stated before, the patterns and trends are determined by many events over space and time. They're not dictated by usually one. Determining the trajectory of carbon, whether that's going to be a source or a sink for a given period, requires an ability to detect a signal from the background noise. And specifically, they're trying to see specific effects. These effects are going to have to be very large and massive, either hundreds of thousands or millions of acres, or changes in environmental conditions such as climate or some other environmental factor that's affecting the forest really broadly. So the answer to the question is, you can't really put the effects of specific management in the or particular disturbance events, individual ones, in a meaningful context in terms of trying to understand what's going on with your forest. So that's really important for a planning context and putting contextualizing management and other things that are going on. So, so let's talk a little bit about the putting things into context. So this is a really cool graph. We call it the bathtub figure. Imagine putting all the carbon on the national forest system, roughly 10,300 teragrams of carbon, and thinking about that in terms of water in a bathtub. That would roughly fill about an 80-gallon bathtub. And so based on the information that we received from the science, the amount of information that is coming in through gross growth is roughly 42 ounces. And what we know is leaving through disturbances, mainly for natural disturbances such as insects and disease and wildfires, is about 8 ounces. So the net gain that we're seeing on the national forest system is 31 ounces. Now, if you look at the bath towel over there, you can see we were able to determine how much of this is related to harvesting. And that's roughly about 3 ounces. So the national forest system is gaining about 10 times of net, in terms of net growth, than what is being removed for harvested wood products. Let me also put, and we can also put this in the context of fossil fuel emissions. So this was something I got bored with on the train ride in to work one day, and I was like, let's compare this to coal. So I think this is really interesting. So imagine a 1,000 megawatt power plant. This services about 500,000 people. They that consumes roughly about 9,000 metric tons of coal per day. So that's 90 train cars per day, each carrying about 100 metric tons of coal. Assuming that a anthracite coal is used, that's a particular high energy, has a high energy to carbon ratio. That's about one train car about every 16 minutes. In terms of how many pounds to try to make it more relatable, that's about 220 pounds of coal every second. In terms of carbon, that's about 100 pounds, and that's every second of every day, every month of every year. Nationwide, there are about 125 coal-fired power plants that produce about 1,000 megawatts or greater in the U.S. So imagine that this is not unusual. And so there's over 600 power plants nationwide. I read that there's some power plants in China that are over 6,000 megawatts. So imagine every second that about 1.5 tons of coal is being consumed every second of every day. It's really incredible. So in the U.S., that results in about 310 teragrams annually. So if you look at the figure over here to the right, just to put this in context, what the National Forest System is doing is putting roughly about 3 teragrams into this pathway, harvested wood products pathway, biomass pathway, that is a lot of which, if not most of which, is going to be taken back as the forests regrow, versus the context of how much we're releasing through for power generation with coal. Now, to put it in a bigger context, our national emissions are closer to about 1,800 teragrams, and globally they're well over 10,000. So how do these templates work? So it all starts with a white paper. This white paper contains a thorough analysis from the reports that I mentioned, resource planning assessment that we have, our RPA, vulnerability assessments. It's a really comprehensive white paper that helps a reader, manager, public understand everything that's going on in the forest that's relevant. And this serves as an anchor for projects. So when we're disclosing the effects of projects on carbon, this can tie into or reference the white paper, so there's a solid foundation and context for what we're disclosing. I forgot to mention, this is for forests that are not in revision. So the white paper serves as a backstop for any of the projects that are interested in disclosing their effects on carbon. So for forests in revision, it's a little bit more in depth. The white paper can be easily translated into a plan assessment. And this plan assessment can serve as the backbone for an environmental impact statement for a forest plan. It can also, that forest plan kind of outlines all the potential projects that are happening or could happen on that forest during the next 10 years, for example. So when there's a project level, any projects that are going on, it can, that disclosure can seamlessly tie in with the disclosure, NEPA disclosure at the plan level, which is all based and rooted in the white paper and plan assessment that has even more information in providing that context. So seamlessly they work together. So we really have three different white paper, three different templates: a white paper, forest level NEPA template, and we have a project level template. So these templates include a lot of the broad key concepts that Aurora outlined, and the advantage of having these illustrations is we're trying to explain these, what's in the white paper, for example. You can illustrate this if need be to the public or to the manager or decision maker. The templates are pretty straightforward to use. There's a lot of CAN language that is specific to carbon. There's plenty of opportunity to add more, to remove, to do different things with it. So it's not absolutely prescriptive, but it's kind of a good guide of what's using the information that we have and putting it to really good use and a very effective use. So how do you, here's another example at the project level template. We have a little bit of a menu, or kind of a choose your adventure, if you will. We have different treatments, and there's a lot of these treatments are going to be, their effects in carbon are going to be virtually identical regardless of where that's happening, but there is places to modify that language so that it is locally relevant and specific to what you're doing. We had a lot of challenges with managing figures and data. As you can imagine, all these different models across for all these different national forests resulted in hundreds of Excel files with data everywhere, and most of these Excel files had tabs in them. So how did we put this together in a way that was easily accessible to folks? So all that information was in these reports, but someone on our staff, our data specialist, Nathan Walker, had the visionary idea, well, why don't we use this new program called Tableau? And so what we're able to do is put all that information into a single interface. And this is an example of what you see here is you can pick over here on the left any region that you're interested in, and then you can choose the forest that you're interested in, and it will populate all the figures that are relevant for your forest and give you a table for summarizing the key statistics that you need to fill out the white paper, and well, the templates, I should say, or if you want to use them for other purposes. So it's all right there at your fingertips, and that was an incredible innovation to make the data super accessible. So what are some of the benefits of using these templates that we've seen so far? Increased efficiency. We're seeing folks being able to do these things in a tenth of the time or less that it took them, but the quality is much better. And it's also a lot more consistent and transferable. It's based in the best available science, but most importantly, it produces very clear, concise, and focused documents, not only for the decision maker to make a decision to inform the decision, but it's also really important for the public to see and understand. So I'm going to turn it over to Aurora to talk about our broader strategy.
Sure, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll be quick. This is just basically our communication framework that our office uses on, and this is just what we've done for the carbon work, is creating awareness and educating. And mostly it's been in our internal Forest Service, but some products have gone outward, and we're receiving great feedback on that. And then we're pretty much in the test and trialing phase in the broader scale adoption phase of these templates. So as we move forward, we're learning, evaluating, and seeing what's working and not. So next slide. You could probably just continue to the next one. So we do have actually a lot of products available for the public on our Forest Service website, and Lauren will share that information, I think, when she posts this information, as well as we have a blog about that landlord-tenant relationship and other blogs related to carbon and other resources. And we are getting questions about the graphics. We get a lot of questions about that. If you want access to them, please email me, and we can make arrangements to have them in whatever size you need. And with that, I'll turn it back to Duncan.
Yeah, so just to land on some final thoughts, delivering the carbon science really required us to take a bottom-up and a top-down approach. We had our ideas, but we needed to roll up our sleeves and get in the shoes of the end user. Now is absolutely critical. The conceptual framing and effective communication is essential. Otherwise, people internal to the agency, but also external are talking past one another. And what was one of the big keys here is being able to work with scientists and research and development to create the information that was relevant and specific to each national forest system. That really lent itself to a consistent approach and a template-based approach. And it's imperative to find ways, and one of the innovations that we're particularly proud about is having such an easy interface for end users to be able to easily access and use the information. And again, it's not just about delivering templates where people mindlessly follow. This is about delivering that with an educational component so that they're learning and taking ownership of this and increasing our carbon literacy across the agency. So just a couple of resources that are available. The two reports that I mentioned, the baseline reports and the disturbance reports, are both available online. And lastly, if you have any questions or requests, you can contact me or Aurora. We're available. And with that, I'm going to take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Aurora, Duncan. This was very interesting to learn about your work. You shared a lot of really fantastic graphics. So again, to everyone, feel free to bring a question into the chat or the Q&A. We're monitoring both of them if you have any questions. We do have some great questions here. So to get started, I thought we could cover some more kind of detailed, technical-oriented questions, and then end with some bigger picture questions. One clarification that somebody asked was, what model was used to estimate the carbon life cycle of harvested wood products, or what does the Forest Service use for that?
Yeah, so, sorry I didn't mention that. That's Wood Carb 2 that was produced by Ken Skog at the Forest Product Laboratory.
Okay, great. That's helpful. We could probably link to that as well. And we have gotten a lot of comments about the graphics. So there's a lot of interest in using them. I think people like them a lot. They're very rich ways of interpreting and communicating carbon in different ways. I have gotten a few questions of how to find those. And Aurora, I know after some of the questions came in, you've shared some screenshots of some resources, and I could see some of those graphics there. Aurora is sending those to us as a PDF. So we'll post a PDF of all the graphics. So you're welcome to grab from there. But Aurora, I thought maybe could you clarify how to get access to those? Are there other ways to get access to them? And just what's your vision for other professionals utilizing them in their work?
Sure. So we haven't posted them publicly yet. We may need to, though, because we do get a lot of requests. But mostly people are asking for one or two in different sizes. So if you need something particular, like in a large size, because you're going to a presentation, we're happy to send you that file, whether it's 3 feet by 4 feet, whatever you need. You can just email me. But I will discuss with our team posting all of them on an external site. And then in terms of future products, we're working with MSU to make some of those graphics animations, and those will be posted on our website as well in the future. And then we're also doing some learning-based modules with MSU that will be available soon as well.
Great. And Aurora, we can also chat. Maybe we could post some of the graphics. We have a new open resource, openly available resource on our website as well. So maybe we could post them there and link back to your website. For those that are familiar with our page. So this is a question probably a little more for Duncan. This person wanted some clarification about this idea, and Aurora, I guess, as well. You covered this, but the general positive framing of forest products in terms of carbon and how that's viewed by the Forest Service. But could you clarify a little bit how you think about this in terms of the fact that there's also carbon losses from harvest, and so maybe, you know, and overall there's not a huge percentage ends up in a hardwood product. Could you just talk a little bit about that and what happens to that carbon that doesn't end up in a wood product?
Yeah, so you know, it's you know, taking that broad perspective or space and time is really important, and there is with anytime you're reducing density, whether it's for harvesting or for hazardous fuel reductions, there is some reduction in the carbon stocks there, and a lot of times some of that enters the atmosphere. But in terms of, you know, hazardous fuel treatments, the growth can be really quick, and within less than 5 years or, you know, 10 years, the carbon can be that was lost to the activity is recovered and harvested. But you also have to look at what is that doing? We're a multiple use agency. So, and we're also interested in protecting lives and property. So if reducing the carbon stocks, for example, with hazardous fuel treatments reduces the potential for higher severity fire that can threaten lives and property, that might be a good trade-off. So in terms of harvested wood products, yes, there is some what we call logging residue, where some of the branches and stuff is left on site, and that does decompose and enters the atmosphere. The logs go to a mill where there are what they call milling residues. However, a lot of the companies, the mills, are very, very efficient with milling residues. We think of all the sawdust that's produced when you're sawing logs, and we think, okay, well, it's going to waste. Well, no, it's not going to waste. In fact, a lot of the milling waste in the South, for example, are being used to create wood pellets, which is used for energy generation. A lot of that is happening abroad right now. So, and also some of that milling waste is used to produce energy within the mill itself to heat up the plant. So there's really not a lot of waste. Some of that residue can go into particle board as well. So in terms of whole logs, the lumber that comes out of it, that is very generally goes into long-lived products that can, such as, you know, lumber for a house, for example, that can, you know, have a mean residence time of 80 years or more. So there isn't as much waste as you might think initially. And the other part of this too, that people often ask, is what is the fossil fuel emissions associated with the chainsaws and the truck going into harvesting trees? And it's actually pretty small. Roughly, studies I've seen, about 5% of compared to the amount of carbon that is being removed in terms of the harvested wood products. So, and again, you know, this is about providing services to society that we use, and also looking at the bigger picture. If you were to use that wood, if you have a nice wood beam, for example, and you use that in lieu of a concrete or steel beam, basically you're getting a bump, because the concrete and steel is a much more energy intensive to produce and has more carbon emissions associated with that. So if by using that wood product, you're actually able to leverage that carbon, if you will, to actually resulting in much less carbon into the atmosphere than would happen if you used, you know, a more conventional product like concrete or steel. So it's a long-winded answer, very quick, but I hope I answered it.
No, I think you covered some really important content there, Duncan. And you know, the person that wrote this question, if they want to ask a follow-up, they can reach out to us also at foresty@msu.edu if they have additional questions or would like to see any specific resources. And I do have a number of really great questions here, but we are kind of on the hour. So I thought maybe I could end with kind of a bigger picture question. And Duncan, you've talked on this or touched on this here when you were just speaking, that you know, you're bringing in a number of kind of larger targets and goals and values at the Forest Service, and carbon is just a part of that. Can you speak to some of the challenges, or how has the Forest Service handled some of the trade-offs between biodiversity or carbon carbon concentration in old growth forests versus other uses. So looking at timber or dealing with fire-prone areas. Can you just talk a little bit from like a landscape perspective? How was the Forest Service balancing these types of challenges and opportunities?
Well, I will say that, just to remind folks that being a multiple use agency means that you have to, consider many different things, whether that's species diversity, carbon, water, air, oftentimes on the very same acre. And also we are by statute, and what NEPA makes us do is every time we're going to do an action, we look at every single statute and comply with that, whether that's clean air, clean water, endangered species, and make sure that we're managing that acre as sustainably as we can. And some of the trade-offs end up being that you might lose a bit of carbon, but sometimes those are a trade-off to increase habitat for endangered species, or to, have some other positive benefit. So that's why we don't view, we're not authorized to view carbon as a special set aside. It's all considered in the broad suite of things, and the decision maker, and this depends on who the decision maker is, where that is in the country, has to consider all these, benefits and trade-offs, and ultimately, do the calculus and make a decision. But it's probably all the time that we have.
Yes, and so that was really great. I think it's nice to end with part of a kind of a higher level overview, but it is really fascinating to think about how carbon and climate is an added level of decision making on many forested landscapes, including the Forest Service system. So thank you again to Duncan and Aurora for sharing this really excellent presentation with us. The graphics were very attractive, and there's certainly a lot of interest in utilizing them, and they definitely reflect a lot of hard work in communicating these complex topics in different ways. So a big thank you to Duncan and Aurora for the time and preparation and the time today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who joined today. We are still getting some really wonderful questions. So we'll be following up with Duncan and Aurora. Rest assured we'll get to your questions, and encouraging everyone to circle back around when we post the materials. Take a look at the Q&A, because we're going to be covering a couple of things that we weren't able to touch on here today. And so with that, we're on the hour. So thank you again to our speakers. Thanks to everyone who joined. And we look forward to seeing you in March for the next webinar focusing on the U.S. Climate Alliance and the Natural Working Lands work stream. And we'll see you then. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Aurora.